You're listening to Puma Podcast.
7 taon na ang lumipas mula May 10, 2016. That was the day after Rodrigo Duterte swept the national elections. That was the day news agencies, human rights organizations, and academics studying the matter began counting bodies in his brutal war against illegal drugs. Nagkaroon na ulit tayo ng eleksyon last year. Marami nang nag-move on sa tokhang. Pero sa episode na ito ng Teka Teka News, ito ang aming hiling. That we pause, remember, and reflect. Ako po si Trisha Aquino, Puma Podcast. Malakas ang impluwensya ng relihiyon sa Pilipinas. Nang magtawag si Jaime Cardinal Sin sa Radyo Veritas na pumunta sa EDSA noong 1986, naging susi ito sa pagbagsak ng diktador. Nitong 2022 elections, megachurch leader Apollo Kibuloy endorsed the same dictator's son who is now president. Malaki rin ang papel ng relihiyon sa war on drugs. Nag-usap kami tungkol dito ni Dr. Jayeel Cornelio, isang sociologist of religion mula sa Ateneo de Manila University.
As a sociologist, I'm very much interested in how religion affects interfaces with people's choices, whether it's politics or morality or attitudes towards controversial issues, yun nga, like the war on drugs.
Tinanong ko siya, kung karamihan ng mga Pilipino Kristiyano, bakit karamihan sa atin sinuportahan ang napakarahas na war on drugs? Hindi ba banal na utos ang huwag pumatay? Hindi ba ang paulit-ulit na turo ng simbahan ay magmahal at magpatawad?
Yes, I agree. What we don't see is that there's another moral worldview at play. And why is that? In the midst of this insecurity and weak justice system, we need a God who can administer justice. We need a God who can cleanse Philippine society of its social ills. And makikita natin how that is very much connected to yung notions natin of political will and appreciation for Duterte as somebody who made things happen, bulldozing institutions and so forth. But let's put all of that aside for now. Balikan natin yung moral worldview na God is the God Avenger, the God of justice who is invested in cleansing Philippine society of its social ills.
And in fact, maraming nakausap si Jayeel ng mga pare at pastor na ganito ang paniniwala.
There's one priest who likens Duterte to King Josiah. King Josiah was the king of Judah who removed all the idols around Judah, destroying them. It was brutal, it was violent, but he was a celebrated king for making the place a holy place. Duterte was destroying the social idols of criminality and drugs and so forth. That very much becomes the moral and religious underpinning for the satisfaction that people have with the war on drugs. True enough, people felt safe. Yes, people were afraid that they might be next in line. Pero also, if we are just honest about it, the surveys show that people felt safe in their communities. And we go visit those communities that were affected by tokhang. People would actually laud the tokhang kasi sasabihin nila, oh yan, yung drug addict dyan, wala na sila. Asan na po sila? Kinulong po ba hindi na tokhang?
In September 2017, Jayeel and Aaron Medina, at the time a research associate in Ateneo's Development Studies program, began a 5-month project in Payatas. We know Payatas for its landfill and its destitution. 3 out of 5 Payatas residents don't earn enough for food and other basic needs. By that time, 16 months after the declaration of the war on drugs, 65 drug suspects from the neighborhood had already been killed. Jayeel and Aaron talked to religious leaders ministering to Payatas. They wanted to find out how the beliefs they held about drug users informed their actions towards them. They talked to Catholic priests, Baptist preachers, evangelical pastors, charismatic leaders, Iglesia ni Cristo, and ang Dating Daan. One story that stood out, the evangelical congregation of Pastor Nick, not his real name, accused so-called drug addicts of stealing their musical instruments. Like many other religious leaders they interviewed, Pastor Nick regards drug users as sinners. Religious leaders such as Pastor Nick feel responsible for holding sinners accountable for their actions. Therefore, Pastor Nick actively supports the deadly war on drugs. He helps local officials locate the drug users in the community. He also holds, quote, values formation activities, end quote, for officials and the police.
Ninakaw nga kami ng drum set, ang nagnakaw ay drug addict, therefore supportado ko ang tokhang. Makikita mo talaga how religion was deployed just like that to declare that you are a sinner, irredeemable, and sorry, you have to pay the consequences, right? For example, may mga nakausap kami mga pastor na sinabi na, di ba sabi ng Bible, it's better to tie a rope around somebody's neck and lagyan mo yun ng bato and then throw yourself into the sea than to take advantage of children. Ang kanilang contextual reading ay these drug users are taking advantage of the lives of vulnerable children in places like Payatas. So, sorry, for the wages of sin is death. Yeah. So, tokhang. It overlooks the complexity of the issue. It simply just names it, labels it as sin. When in fact, wait a minute, kung marami nagda-drugs dito sa lugar na ito, sin pa ba yan? Or is a social problem?
Hindi yun ang inasahan ni Jayeel na marinig nung nagsimula siyang mag-research sa Payatas.
Kasi what I was prepared for was a deep theological understanding of the problem and why we should uphold human rights and human dignity in the image of God, Imago Dei. Na parang, tutulong siguro ito. Kasi nga, ganun ang ginagawa ng mga Catholic parish. For example, yung sila Father Danny Pilario.
A Vincentian priest, Father Danny works with Project SO or Support for Orphans and Widows at the Ina ng Lupang Pangako Parish in Payatas. Nagbibigay sila ng livelihood opportunities. Nandyan ang pananahin ng mga bags, face masks at wallets. Nag-aabot din sila ng burial assistance, financial support para sa pag-aaral ng mga bata, at psychosocial interventions. Project SO also helps the victims seek justice. As it turns out, Father Danny is an outlier. Hindi pangkaraniwan.
We managed to interview some of these religious leaders. Some religious leaders just didn't budge.
For most religious leaders in the community, when you use drugs, you separate yourself from God. They do not see that when you use drugs, you're a victim of wider social injustices. They do not see what pushes people to use drugs. For two evangelical pastors, Duterte becoming president was God's way of teaching the country a lesson. Drug addiction was a sin. Committing sins had consequences. Therefore, the violence of tokhang was a form of divine judgment. The killings in the war on drugs were justified, and the anti-drug campaign would convince people of the price of sin. For religious leaders holding the view that drug users were sinners, their approach to solving the drug problem was spiritual. They remind drug users by sharing the gospel with them to go back to how God designed them to be. This approach would cause drug users to, quote, flee from their vices, unquote, in Pastor Nick's words. Religious leaders like him believe that the role of the church is to convince drug users to turn away from their sins because the love of God was waiting for them. In contrast, a handful of religious leaders saw drug users as ordinary people trying to make their miserable living conditions more bearable, as regular folk trying to survive another anxious day of hunger, insecurity, and disease. For them, social ills and material conditions have to be addressed to help drug users with their addiction. But why these divergent views among Christian leaders when their beliefs are based on the same Bible? Jayeel and Aaron think the difference lies in the kind of pastoral encounters the religious leaders had with drug users. If there was no interaction at all, the tendency is to view drug use as simply something that requires a spiritual response. For congregations like Pastor Nick's who suspected that their church instruments were stolen by drug users, their negative experience only reinforced their belief that drug use is evil. But congregations that mourned with their kaparokya who lost lives and relatives to the drug war saw users as victims of the wider evils of poverty and inequality. Mas may malawak silang pagtingin sa pinagdadaanan ng mga kapatid sa pananampalataya. They have more empathy for suffering brothers and sisters of the faith. Mas may malalim silang pangunawa sa kasamaan ng kawalan ng katarungang panlipunan. From Payatas, Jayeel shifted focus from churches of the poorest of the poor to the churches of the powerful.
Wait a minute. Why are these mega churches quiet about the war on drugs? Tapos bibigyan mo pa ako ng verse na Romans 13:1, maririnig mo sa mga preachings, and just obey the government because they have been appointed there by God and they have been given the power of the sword. Again, invoking that metaphor for killing people. Wait a minute, what kind of Christianity are we really harboring in this country?
Simply put, a megachurch is a church with 2,000 members. Over the last few years, we've seen the rise of megachurches like Victory and CCF, which, for the most part, cater to the middle and upper classes.
They're very much interested in conquering, taking over spaces. They draw on what we call the dominion theology, essentially saying that Christians have the mandate from God to take over different spheres of society: show business, politics, the judiciary, the business sector, and so forth. That dominion theology, you merge it with this ethos of becoming big, you really produce very influential mega churches.
Here's an exchange Jayeel and I had during that interview.
Tama po ba yung pagkakaintindi ko doon sa article nyo on mega churches na parang in the end, yung tinuturo nila ay pinoprotektahan lang din yung interest ng mga upper class?
Yes, that is exactly, yes. The theology of simply obeying the government, praying for the government, protects no one but the people who are safe. And who are the safest people in this country? Those people who live in gated communities or in condominiums. And essentially, these are the members of these mega churches. It would be, I think, a very different theology if babad na babad talaga sa communities. But also how you discuss these ideas, how you theologize, and how you engage the scriptures in the light of what you're experiencing. So, kung nanakawan ka ng drum set, at tapos ang ginamit mong verse doon ay, ano nga ba yun? Thou shalt not steal. Tapos ang usapan. Pero kung nanakawan ka ng drum set, tapos pag-uusapan nyo muna bago kayo gumamit ng verse ay, bakit? Ano ba ang problema? Common ba ito dito sa ating lugar? Bago magbitaw ng moral judgment, you have a fairer shot at a more relevant and responsive theology.
May isa pang problema. Our conversations about our faith usually happen in echo chambers. And this sort of environment is often fundamentalist.
It's a way of thinking within Christianity with respect to the scriptures in particular. Literalist readings of the scriptures, meaning to say, take it as it is, with its implications are on political life, family life, gender, and many other aspects of public life. We see that it's fundamentalist kasi it uses the Bible to justify patriarchy, the headship of the man.
So, may hope ba?
I'm writing a book now based on another project, Religion and Gender, LGBTs and Christianity. Young adults, queer, Becky, LGBT, ganyan. Pinakahuling tanong would be, so sa tingin mo may pag-asa ba ang Pilipinas? May pag-asa ba tayo sa Pilipinas for gender equality and ganyan-ganyan? Sasabihin ng mga maraming ilang beses, oo naman. Bakit? Kasi mamamatay rin sila.
But on a serious note,
it's a multi-sectoral approach where people could publicly engage one another about their theologies. Not siguro to condemn one another, but in a spirit of democracy. Hey, present your case, let me present my case. We don't need to agree, pero at the very least, you need to understand where we are coming from.
tinanong ko si Jayeel, kumusta na tayo as a Christian nation 7 years after the first tokhang killing?
There's a lot more that needs to be done. for Christian communities in this country to really reflect on the consequences of the beliefs that they preach and embrace. Do they realize that their theologies justified what could be the deadliest policy campaign in our recent history? Consequences that would affect generations of Filipinos. We don't know who they are, we don't know where they are because they're out there in the outskirts. And we can carry on raising our hands, praying to God, thanking God for the grace and the blessing. That's it. I believe that Christianity is a beautiful religion because it has the potential to be prophetic, to speak out in favor of the oppressed. But all of that is erased in the face of this drive to become big, this drive to become politically influential, this drive to become a famous church or a famous congregation or an influential church. This is the story of our Christianity in this country today. It's not hopeless kasi we're having this conversation pa eh. Pero in the years ahead, there will be many other issues along the way. I don't want Christianity to simply be about one issue after another. More importantly, I want Christianity or Christians or even non-Christians to engage one another and challenge one another to reflect on the consequences of what they believe on social, political, and public life.
And that was today's episode of Teka Teka News. Again, I'm Trisha Aquino, Puma Podcast. I produced this episode. It was edited by Pidoy Blanco. 7 years after the first drug-related killing, we continue to remember and reflect. We continue to assess government policy on illegal drugs, to understand how Duterte's deadly tokhang policy has impacted our life as a congregation, as a community, and as a nation, because we want to know how we move forward in the next 5 years under Bongbong Marcos. That's in another Puma Podcast show, Tokhang sa Tokhang Season 2. Follow Tokhang sa Tokhang and Teka Teka News wherever you get your podcasts. Maraming salamat po.